The bridge of the Defiance Edge hummed with the steady rhythm of deep space exploration as Captain Marcus Rodriguez reviewed the latest sensor sweeps from the Kepler Nebula's outer rim. 3 months into their survey mission, his crew had catalogued 17 new star systems and discovered 2 potentially habitable worlds, making this one of the most successful expeditions in recent human space exploration history. Lieutenant Jake Thompson looked up from his tactical station, his weathered face creased with concern as an unusual reading flickered across his display. "Captain, I'm picking up massive gravitational distortions at bearing 27 Mark IV, approximately 15,000 kilometers off our starboard bow," he reported, his fingers dancing across the control interface to refine the sensor array's focus. Rodriguez moved to Thompson's station, studying the data streams that painted an increasingly troubling picture of what lay hidden within the nebula's swirling gases and electromagnetic interference. Chief Petty Officer Amanda Walsh emerged from the engineering section, wiping grease from her hands as she approached the captain with her latest report on the ship's experimental fusion drive modifications, but stopped mid-sentence when she noticed the tense atmosphere on the bridge. The gravitational readings continued to intensify, suggesting the presence of not just one massive object, but hundreds of them, each one larger than Earth's most powerful dreadnought-class vessels, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate formation moving with purpose through the cosmic darkness. Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten as the implications became clear. This wasn't a natural phenomenon or a derelict fleet, but an active armada of unknown origin and unprecedented size, traveling on a direct course toward inhabited space. Navigation Officer Tyler Brooks confirmed the fleet's trajectory with growing alarm, calculating that their current heading would take them straight to the Zilani homeworld, a peaceful species known throughout the galaxy for their remarkable healing technologies and their complete commitment to nonviolence. The Defiance Edge, a mid-class exploration vessel with modest defensive capabilities and a crew of 43, suddenly found itself in the impossible position of being the only witness to what appeared to be an impending assault on one of the galaxy's most defenseless civilizations. As the alien fleet emerged more clearly from the nebula's concealment, revealing warships of dark, angular design unlike anything in the databases of known galactic species, Rodriguez realized that his next decision would determine not only the fate of his crew and ship, but potentially the lives of 8 billion innocent Zilani who had no idea that death was approaching their world from the stars. The crystalline halls of the Galactic Council chambers resonated with urgent transmissions as emergency beacon signals triggered the most hastily convened session in over 2 centuries of interstellar governance. Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the Terran Federation stood before the massive holographic display showing the Defiance Edge's sensor data, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was presenting to the assembled representatives of 47 different species. The Cien Empire's delegation, led by the imposing figure of War Commander Zeth Kaler, shifted restlessly in their environmental suits as they processed the tactical implications of an unknown fleet numbering in the hundreds, their warrior culture immediately recognizing the threat such a force represented to galactic stability. Across the chamber, the ancient Void Walkers maintained their characteristic silence, their translucent forms flickering with barely perceptible patterns that those familiar with their species recognized as intense deliberation, though their conclusions remained hidden behind millennia of practiced diplomatic neutrality. Prime Minister David Richardson, representing the Zilani through their non-aggression pact with humanity, pleaded desperately for immediate intervention, his normally composed demeanor cracking as he described the complete defenselessness of his adopted people's homeworld, where 8 billion souls lived in cities protected by nothing more than energy shields designed to regulate weather patterns rather than repel military assault. The hegemony of Keth sent ripples of concern through their bioluminescent communication networks, while the Silicon Confederacy's mechanical representatives processed probability matrices at lightning speed, their calculations consistently showing catastrophic outcomes for any species that fell within the unknown fleet's projected path. Ambassador Charles Morgan of the Colonial Defense Alliance argued passionately for immediate fleet mobilization, pointing out that the mysterious Armada's emergence from extragalactic space represented a threat that could potentially target any civilization once they had established a foothold in known space, making the Zilani crisis everyone's problem rather than an isolated incident. However, The seasoned politicians of the council had spent decades perfecting the art of calculated inaction, and elder diplomat Patricia Wells of the Centauri Collective raised the familiar specter of insufficient intelligence, arguing that any hasty military response could be misinterpreted as aggression by beings whose intentions remained completely unknown to galactic civilization. The aquatic nation's representative, breathing apparatus bubbling with agitation, supported the call for caution while simultaneously acknowledging the moral impossibility of abandoning an entire species to potential extinction, creating the kind of circular logic that had paralyzed the Council during previous crises involving smaller-scale conflicts. As hours stretched into an exhausting marathon of debate, the real issue became clear to those willing to acknowledge it. The Council's member species had grown comfortable with their established territories and trade relationships, and none wanted to risk their own populations and fleets against an enemy whose capabilities remained completely unknown, especially when the immediate threat was directed toward a species that contributed little to galactic military or economic power. Administrator Frank Torres from the Outer Rim territories pointed out the bitter irony that the Zolani's greatest strength, their revolutionary medical technologies that had extended lifespans across dozens of species, had become their greatest vulnerability, as their complete commitment to healing and nonviolence had left them utterly unprepared for the realities of hostile contact with aggressive civilizations. The final vote came after 16 hours of continuous session, with the Council reaching its predictable decision to implement strategic observation protocols, a bureaucratic euphemism for doing absolutely nothing while maintaining the illusion of responsible oversight through long-range monitoring and intelligence gathering. Ambassador Kevin Sullivan of the Mars Defense Coordination spoke the words that many were thinking but few would voice, declaring that the Council's decision represented a moral failure that would be remembered throughout galactic history as the moment when fear and political calculation triumphed over basic decency and the fundamental obligation to protect innocent life. As the session concluded with the formal adoption of non-intervention policies, encrypted transmissions raced across space toward the Defiance edge, informing Captain Rodriguez that his small vessel and crew of 43 had been officially designated as the Council's primary intelligence asset in the developing crisis, a designation that translated to complete abandonment by the very governmental body that claimed to represent the interests of galactic civilization and the protection of all sentient species within their jurisdiction. The Defiance Edge drifted in the shadow of a dead asteroid field, her hull scarred by micrometeorite impacts as Captain Rodriguez and his senior staff huddled around the central holographic display, analyzing the fragments of intercepted communications they had managed to decode from the mysterious fleet's transmissions during 18 hours of desperate intelligence gathering. Chief Petty Officer Amanda Walsh had pushed the ship's passive sensors far beyond their recommended operational limits, jury-rigging additional processing power from the ship's secondary systems to penetrate the alien fleet's sophisticated encryption protocols, her engineering expertise proving invaluable as pattern after pattern emerged from what had initially seemed like incomprehensible data streams. Lieutenant Jake Thompson's tactical analysis grew increasingly grim as he cross-referenced the decoded information with historical databases, his face pale as he discovered disturbing parallels to ancient legends and half-remembered warnings from the galaxy's oldest civilizations, stories that had been dismissed as mythology until this moment when fiction became terrifying reality. The intercepted communications revealed the fleet's true identity. They were the Devourers, a nomadic extragalactic force that had been consuming entire star systems for millennia, traveling between galaxies in vast armadas that would strip worlds of all biological and technological resources before moving on to their next target, leaving behind nothing but lifeless husks drifting in space as monuments to civilizations that had once thrived among the stars. Navigation Officer Tyler Brooks discovered references in the ancient Void Walker archives to previous encounters with similar forces, dating back over 50,000 years, describing entities that would arrive without warning to harvest everything of value from populated systems, taking particular interest in species that had developed unique biological or technological capabilities that could enhance their own adaptive evolution. The most chilling revelation came when communications specialist Rachel Kim successfully decrypted a detailed targeting analysis that the Devourers had compiled on the Zolani homeworld, revealing that the peaceful species had been selected not randomly, but specifically because their revolutionary healing technologies represented exactly the kind of biological advancement that the Devourers sought to incorporate into their own hybrid physiology. Medical Officer Dr. Brian Foster examined the tactical assessments with growing horror, realizing that the Devourers viewed the Zolani's regenerative capabilities as the perfect complement to their existing arsenal of absorbed technologies and biological adaptations, making them the most valuable target the fleet had encountered in their current galactic incursion. Security Chief Lisa Chen uncovered evidence that the Devourers had been monitoring galactic communications for decades, slowly building comprehensive profiles of every major civilization and their technological capabilities, with the Zolani marked as a priority acquisition target because their pacifist nature virtually guaranteed they would offer no meaningful resistance to harvesting operations. The crew learned that previous civilizations had tried various defensive strategies against Devourer incursions, but the aliens' ability to rapidly adapt and incorporate new technologies made conventional military responses largely ineffective, as each absorbed species added their knowledge and capabilities to the collective Devourer force, creating an exponentially growing threat that became more dangerous with every successful conquest. Engineer Mark Davis discovered that the Devourers employed specialized harvesting vessels within their fleet, designed to extract both living specimens and technological resources while their population remained conscious, allowing them to study adaptation processes in real time and maximize the efficiency of their biological integration protocols. The intercepted data revealed a systematic approach to civilization destruction that had been refined over millions of years of practice, with the Devourers maintaining detailed protocols for everything from initial planetary assessment to final resource extraction, treating entire species as nothing more than raw materials to be processed and consumed in their endless quest for evolutionary perfection. Captain Rodriguez felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he realized that the Galactic Council's decision to maintain strategic observation had essentially handed the Zolani over to a fate worse than simple extinction. They would become unwilling components in a galactic horror that had already consumed countless civilizations throughout the universe, their healing gifts twisted into tools of conquest that would be used against future victims in an endless cycle of predation and absorption. The final piece of the puzzle came when they discovered that the Devourer fleet's current configuration suggested they were preparing for an extended campaign within this galaxy, meaning that the Zolani were merely the first target in what would likely become a systematic harvesting of every valuable civilization within reach, transforming the known galaxy into a feeding ground for entities that viewed all sentient life as nothing more than resources to be exploited and consumed. The silence in the Defiance Edge's conference room stretched for nearly a full minute after Captain Rodriguez finished outlining his proposed course of action, his words hanging in the recycled air like a death sentence that each crew member processed according to their own understanding of mathematics, tactics, and the fundamental impossibility of a single mid-class exploration vessel engaging a fleet of hundreds of advanced warships in meaningful combat. Lieutenant Jake Thompson was the first to break the stunned quiet, his voice carefully controlled as he pointed out that their ship's defensive capabilities were designed for deflecting space debris and minor pirate encounters, notwithstanding the concentrated firepower of an armada that could probably vaporize them from a range beyond their own weapons' effective targeting distance, making any direct engagement essentially equivalent to an elaborate form of suicide with no strategic benefit whatsoever. Chief Petty Officer Amanda Walsh shook her head slowly, running calculations on her personal tablet that showed their fusion reactor's maximum output could sustain defensive shields for perhaps 12 minutes under heavy bombardment, while their offensive capabilities consisted of 2 plasma cannons that would need to score direct hits on critical systems to have any hope of disabling even a single enemy vessel, assuming they could somehow survive long enough to fire more than a few shots before being obliterated. Communications specialist Rachel Kim voiced what everyone was thinking when she suggested that perhaps their duty lay in escaping to warn other civilizations and coordinate a proper military response, arguing that throwing away their lives in a hopeless gesture would accomplish nothing except depriving the galaxy of valuable intelligence about Devourer capabilities and tactical preferences, information that could prove crucial in organizing effective resistance against future incursions. Dr. Brian Foster supported the withdrawal option from a medical perspective, pointing out that their crew represented decades of training and experience that would be impossible to replace, while medical technician Sarah Williams added that their survival could mean the difference between the galaxy understanding the Devourer threat and remaining ignorant of the enemy's true capabilities until it was too late to mount any meaningful defense. Security Chief Lisa Chen presented the tactical reality with brutal honesty, explaining that even if they somehow managed to damage or destroy a few enemy vessels, such losses would be statistically insignificant against a fleet of that size, while their own destruction would eliminate the only witnesses to Devourer operational methods, potentially dooming future civilizations to the same fate as the Zilani through simple ignorance of what they would be facing. Captain Rodriguez listened to each argument with the patience of a man who had already weighed every possible consideration, his weathered face reflecting the internal struggle between rational military thinking and the deeper conviction that had been growing within him since they first discovered the scope of the threat facing an entire innocent civilization. He acknowledged the mathematical certainty of their destruction while pointing out that 8 billion Zilani lives hung in the balance, and that someone needed to make a stand against an evil so profound that it threatened the very concept of civilization itself, regardless of whether that stand had any chance of tactical success or strategic significance in the broader conflict that was surely coming. Engineer Mark Davis raised the point that their sacrifice might inspire other species to action, but Navigation Officer Tyler Brooks countered that dead heroes couldn't coordinate resistance movements or share tactical intelligence, making their survival potentially more valuable than any symbolic gesture they might achieve through martyrdom in an unwinnable battle against overwhelming odds. The debate continued for another hour as crew members wrestled with the fundamental question of whether moral obligations could supersede practical considerations. But gradually the tone shifted as individual voices began acknowledging that they had signed up for exploration duty precisely because they believed in humanity's responsibility to push boundaries and stand for principles that transcended simple self-preservation, even when facing circumstances that challenged every rational instinct for survival. The turning point came when Chief Petty Officer Walsh quietly announced that she would rather die fighting for something meaningful than live with the knowledge that they had abandoned innocent people to unspeakable horror simply because the odds were against them, and one by one, other crew members voiced similar sentiments until even the most vocally opposed officers found themselves nodding in reluctant agreement with their captain's impossible decision. As the meeting concluded with unanimous consent to engage the Devourer fleet, each crew member understood they were probably voting for their own deaths, but they also recognized that some battles had to be fought regardless of their outcome, because the alternative was accepting a universe where might always triumphed over right and where decent people stood aside while evil consumed everything good and innocent in its path. The Defiance edge streaked through the Kepler Nebula's outer edge like a predatory fish hunting in deep ocean trenches, her hull barely visible against the swirling gases and electromagnetic storms that Captain Rodriguez had chosen as humanity's unlikely battlefield against an enemy that had never faced opponents willing to turn environmental hazards into weapons of war. Chief Petty Officer Amanda Walsh had spent the previous 6 hours rewiring their plasma cannons to create feedback loops through the nebula's charged particle fields, transforming each shot into a cascading energy discharge that would amplify their firepower exponentially while using the natural electromagnetic interference to mask their attack vectors from Devourer targeting systems that had been designed to track enemies in open space rather than within the chaotic environment of stellar nurseries. Lieutenant Jake Thompson coordinated their assault from the tactical station, his fingers flying across controls that had been jury-rigged to fire modified mining charges through their cargo launchers, each explosive device programmed to detonate in proximity to the gravitational anomalies that engineer Mark Davis had identified throughout the nebula, creating artificial gravity wells that would disrupt Devourer formation integrity and force their massive vessels into collision courses with each other. The first strike came without warning as the Defiance Edge emerged from a pocket of dense gas directly beneath a Devourer command ship, their amplified plasma cannons tearing through the alien vessel's shields before disappearing back into the nebula's concealment like a ghost ship that could strike from any direction at any moment, leaving the enemy fleet scrambling to adapt their tactics to an opponent that refused to engage according to conventional space combat protocols. Communications specialist Rachel Kim had discovered that the Devourers relied heavily on networked coordination between their vessels, so she began broadcasting false tactical data on frequencies that mimicked their command structure, creating confusion in their ranks as ships received contradictory orders and targeting information that sent them chasing phantom contacts while the real threat maneuvered into position for devastating surprise attacks. Navigation Officer Tyler Brooks exploited his intimate knowledge of the nebula's topology to guide their ship through gravitational currents and magnetic field variations that would tear apart larger vessels, using the Defiance Edge's smaller size and superior maneuverability to access attack positions that the massive Devourer warships could never hope to reach without risking structural collapse from the intense tidal forces generated by conflicting gravitational fields. Dr. Brian Foster and medical technician Sarah Williams had been tasked with an unconventional mission, analyzing Devourer biosignatures to identify psychological pressure points that could be exploited through targeted harassment, leading to a series of hit-and-run attacks designed not just to inflict physical damage but to create growing paranoia and uncertainty among an enemy that had grown accustomed to overwhelming technological superiority and predictable resistance patterns from their previous victims. Security Chief Lisa Chen coordinated the release of modified probe drones that had been reprogrammed to mimic the energy signatures of full-sized warships, creating a phantom fleet within the nebula that forced the Devourers to divide their attention and firepower among dozens of false targets while the real Defiance Edge continued its deadly game of appearing, striking, and vanishing before the enemy could coordinate an effective response to their unprecedented tactical approach. The crew's most devastating innovation came when Walsh successfully modified their fusion reactor to create controlled instabilities that could be channeled through the ship's hull, turning the Defiance Edge itself into a massive electromagnetic pulse generator that could disable Devourer systems within a limited range, though each use brought them closer to a catastrophic reactor breach that would vaporize their own ship along with any nearby enemies. As the battle progressed, the Devourer fleet's initial dismissive confidence began to crack under the relentless psychological pressure of fighting an enemy that seemed to materialize from thin air, strike with impossible precision, and disappear before retaliation became possible, creating a growing sense of vulnerability among beings that had spent millennia as unchallenged apex predators in a galaxy filled with defenseless prey species. The Defiance Edge had successfully destroyed 7 enemy vessels and critically damaged twice that number using tactics that no military academy had ever taught, proving that human creativity and desperate courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds when combined with intimate knowledge of local conditions and a complete willingness to risk everything for principles that transcended mere survival, though each victory brought them closer to the inevitable moment when their luck would run out and they would face the mathematical certainty of their own destruction against an enemy that was rapidly adapting to their unconventional warfare methods. The encrypted transmission burst from the Kepler Nebula reached every major communications hub across the galaxy within 12 hours, carrying with it footage of a single human vessel dancing through impossible odds against an armada that had materialized from the dark spaces between galaxies like a nightmare given form and purpose. The images spreading through official channels and underground networks alike until every sentient being with access to galactic communications had witnessed the unprecedented sight of 43 humans choosing to fight and die rather than allow 8 billion innocent lives to be consumed by an evil beyond their power to stop. On the Xian homeworld, young warriors gathered in training academies to watch the tactical displays over and over again, their martial culture recognizing the pure courage displayed by Captain Rodriguez and his crew even as their elders maintained official support for the Galactic Council's policy of strategic observation, creating a generational divide that would soon explode into open rebellion against established military doctrine. The crystalline cities of the Void Walker worlds resonated with unprecedented patterns of agitation as their youth movements began questioning millennia of practiced neutrality, with translucent beings who had never before challenged their ancient leadership now demanding explanations for why their vast fleets remained inactive while a single human ship bore the burden that should have been shared by every civilization capable of mounting a defense against the Devourer threat. Within the bioluminescent communication networks of the hegemony of Keth, urgent debates flashed between colony worlds as younger generations argued that their species' historical policy of careful non-involvement had become a moral failure when applied to genocide on an interstellar scale, while their traditional leaders struggled to maintain unity in the face of growing demands for immediate military intervention regardless of potential consequences to their own territories and trade. Relationships. The Silicon Confederacy's mechanical representatives found their probability matrices overwhelmed by cascading social variables as their constituent populations began generating protest algorithms that demanded recalculation of risk assessments to include moral and ethical factors that had previously been considered irrelevant to strategic decision-making processes, creating computational feedback loops that threatened the stability of their entire governmental structure. Ambassador Elena Vasquez discovered that her office had been flooded with over 10 million communications from human colonies throughout known space, each message demanding that the Terran Federation withdraw from the Galactic Council and organize an independent relief fleet, regardless of whether such action would violate existing treaties and potentially trigger a broader conflict between humanity and the established galactic power structure that had maintained peace for over 2 centuries. The aquatic nations found their underwater cities erupting in demonstrations as young amphibious beings organized massive synchronized swimming protests that disrupted commercial shipping lanes, their fluid movements carrying messages of support for the Defiance Edge that could be read from orbital observation platforms, creating a visual spectacle that forced their leadership to acknowledge growing public sentiment in favor of immediate intervention despite the potential risks to their carefully maintained neutrality. On the peaceful agricultural worlds of the Centauri Collective, farmers and terraforming specialists began organizing supply convoys destined for potential refugee populations, their practical approach to the crisis highlighting the growing gap between civilian populations who demanded action and political leaders who continued to prioritize diplomatic stability over moral obligation to protect innocent life from extragalactic predators. The most dramatic response came from the Colonial Defense Alliance, where Admiral Jennifer Walsh announced that her fleets would depart for the Zilani system within 72 hours regardless of official governmental authorization, citing her oath to protect all sentient life from existential threats as superseding any political considerations that might prevent appropriate military response to an ongoing genocide being perpetrated by entities from outside known galactic civilization. Prime Minister David Richardson faced unprecedented political pressure as representatives from dozens of species began withdrawing their support for the Galactic Council's leadership, with some governments threatening to establish alternative governing bodies that would prioritize action over deliberation when facing threats of existential magnitude, effectively challenging the fundamental authority structure that had maintained interstellar peace and cooperation for generations. The breaking point arrived when encrypted recordings of council deliberations were leaked by unknown sources, revealing the calculated political considerations that had led to the abandonment of the Zilani homeworld, with transcripts showing various ambassadors expressing explicit concern about risking their own species' resources for the benefit of what they privately considered a strategically insignificant civilization that contributed little to galactic military or economic power. As public outrage reached critical mass across dozens of worlds, younger members of various species governments began organizing what they called the Emergency Coalition, an informal alliance dedicated to bypassing official council authority and mounting an immediate relief operation inspired by the example of human courage displayed by the crew of the Defiance Edge, whose desperate battle against impossible odds had become a rallying cry for beings throughout the galaxy who believed that some principles were worth fighting for regardless of the mathematical probability of victory or the potential political consequences of taking action when established leadership proved inadequate to address moral crises of unprecedented magnitude. The Emergency Coalition's hastily assembled fleet of over 300 vessels from 17 different species arrived at the Kepler Nebula to find the Defiance Edge somehow still functional despite catastrophic damage to her hull and the loss of nearly half her crew, including Captain Rodriguez, who had sacrificed himself to manually detonate their modified fusion reactor in the heart of the Devourer command formation, an act of desperate heroism that had crippled the enemy fleet's coordination systems and bought precious time for the rescue armada to arrive before the surviving alien vessels could complete their assault on the defenseless Zilani homeworld. Admiral Jennifer Walsh of the Colonial Defense Alliance took command of the combined fleet with unprecedented authority granted by the Emergency Coalition's founding charter, coordinating an attack that combined the Sien warrior aggression with Void Walker technological sophistication and human tactical innovation, creating a unified military response that the Devourers had never encountered in their millennia of consuming isolated civilizations throughout multiple galaxies. Lieutenant Jake Thompson, now serving as acting captain aboard the crippled Defiance Edge, provided crucial intelligence about Devourer weaknesses and tactical preferences that his crew had discovered during their impossible 3-day battle, information that proved invaluable as the Coalition forces adapted their strategies to exploit vulnerabilities in alien shield systems and coordination protocols that had previously seemed impenetrable to conventional military analysis. The battle for the Zilani system became a turning point in galactic history as species that had never before fought alongside each other discovered the exponential increase in combat effectiveness that came from combining their unique technological and tactical approaches, with Keth bioluminescent communication networks providing instantaneous coordination between widely separated fleet elements, while Silicon Confederacy computational power optimized targeting solutions faster than any individual species could have managed alone. Chief Petty Officer Amanda Walsh, working from the Defiance Edge's damaged engineering section, successfully transmitted her fusion reactor modification protocols to coalition forces, enabling dozens of vessels to replicate the electromagnetic pulse attacks that had proven so effective against Devourer systems, turning the enemy's own technological sophistication against them as their networked coordination systems became liability rather than advantage when faced with coordinated electronic warfare tactics. The Devourer's final defeat came not through overwhelming firepower but through the psychological impact of facing unified resistance from beings they had expected to encounter as isolated, terrified victims, their confidence shattered by the reality that their extragalactic incursion had awakened something unprecedented in this galaxy, a willingness among diverse civilizations to set aside traditional rivalries and territorial concerns when facing threats that transcended individual species. Survival instincts. As the surviving Devourer vessels retreated into deep space, carrying word of their defeat back to whatever extragalactic empire had sent them, the coalition forces found themselves transformed by their shared victory into something that had never before existed in galactic politics, a genuinely unified military command structure that had proven capable of coordinating effective resistance against existential threats while maintaining respect for the sovereignty and cultural integrity of all participating civilizations. The Galactic Council's authority collapsed within weeks of the Coalition's triumphant return, as member species formally withdrew their support for a governmental structure that had proven incapable of decisive action when faced with genocide on an interstellar scale, replacing it with the new Galactic Defense Federation that prioritized rapid response to emerging threats over the careful diplomatic deliberation that had characterized previous interstellar governance for over 2 centuries. Ambassador Elena Vasquez found herself elected as the Federation's first Secretary-General, a position that reflected humanity's new role as the species that had demonstrated the moral courage necessary to inspire others when established leadership failed, though she insisted that the real credit belonged to Captain Rodriguez and his crew who had chosen to fight impossible odds rather than accept the unacceptable reality of innocent civilizations being consumed by predators from beyond the known galaxy. The Defiance Edge was towed back to Earth orbit where she became a permanent memorial to the principle that some battles must be fought regardless of their mathematical probability of success, her scarred hull serving as a reminder that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds when applied with creativity, desperation, and absolute commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves from forces that viewed all sentient life as nothing more than resources to be harvested and consumed. Dr. Brian Foster and the surviving crew members became the Federation's first interspecies crisis response team, their experience fighting the Devourers providing invaluable expertise for training the mixed species units that would guard against future extragalactic incursions, while the tactical innovations they had developed in the crucible of hopeless battle became standard doctrine for Federation forces throughout known space. The transformation of galactic civilization from a collection of cautious, self-interested species into a unified defense network capable of protecting innocent life from existential threats had been purchased with the lives of 21 humans who chose to stand against darkness when no one else would, proving that sometimes the smallest actions could reshape the destiny of entire galaxies when undertaken with sufficient courage and moral clarity.